Sondra Green, and I'm a past president, a past general campaign chair, and a past women's division chair. And I've been involved for many years, even prior to Vancouver becoming federated. My late father and Lois Rafel, who unfortunately couldn't be here today, were instrumental in starting the federation. In the 80s, they were asked to come east by UIA and talk about it because at the time, Vancouver had two separate campaigns, one for the local funding council and one for overseas. And they felt that overseas was heavily favored and that our local community was, to use her expression, being starved and wasn't getting enough of the donations because donors always gave more of their money to Israel. And so they went east and they discussed it with them, and they explained how they felt they could really help the Vancouver community itself and the community institutions do better if we became federated. So Dad and Lois came back to Vancouver and talked to the people that were involved in the community, and I guess it was a tough sell at first. People were worried that Israel would suffer, but eventually the UJA board passed the decision to become federated, and so they started looking for an executive director and a president, and that's kind of how it began. And I came from a family that was always involved in community, and when I was first married, I lived out of town, and when I came back, I became involved, and that was in the 70s. So I guess you could say I've been involved since then, and I had a lull in between a bit there when my kids were younger, and I was on my own for a bit taking care of them, but then became very involved again in the 80s and 90s.
So what was your first formal position with Federation?
With Federation or with UJA?
Well, let's talk about both.
Okay. I guess I was Super Sunday chairman was probably my first, and I was always involved with Super Sunday, and then I moved through becoming, division chairs in the women's division, and canvassing and taking a division, and then from there I went after Vancouver was federated. I became women's division chair, and so I guess that would be my first real involvement was in the women's division. And
can you recall or tell us the big challenges that you were facing back then in that position?
The challenge was always, and probably still is to some extent, convincing people that federation is a good thing, and because they were used to the old ways and didn't always feel that their pet institution was getting the proper funding, and that federation was good for the whole community. So I think that was probably the hardest thing that any of us had to deal with back then, and I think it's much better now. But as I say, that was the main thing that was difficult, and of course getting people to part with their money.
And do you recall what year it was that you became president?
2001.
Okay. Did you notice a big change between, those very early days in 2001?
Yes. I mean, it was easier. I think more and more people did understand. When I became president, unfortunately, or at the time, executive director, just before I stepped into the position, left to go to Philadelphia. It was Drew Staffenberg. So Judy Weinstein ably took over, and as she was his assistant executive director. And so one of the challenges was then, of course, finding another executive director. But I think people were more willing to participate and to become involved. There were always some that were resistant, but as they saw that the institutions were getting funded and that it was an open process and people could see how it was done, I think they became more comfortable with the federation itself. I guess I could say that one achievement, that was the first woman president of the federation. So I thought it was nice that women started to become more involved, and there have been others since myself, so that's good. Other than that, there were just lots of little things that, meeting campaign goals, getting people involved or giving that had been resistant before. surprises of people giving more than you anticipated them to, or responding to you because it was, when I was president, I found there were people that if I went to canvass them, that because of my history with the community and because of my family, were more willing to listen and to give more and to become, participants and involved in the community. So I think that was a good thing.
Okay. When you think about our community, not just Federation, but our community as a whole today versus some 30 years ago, are there any really big differences that stand out for you?
Oh, it's much larger and far more spread out and diverse. When I first got involved, the community center was kind of the center of the city. And as I moved through and when I became president, by then, of course, there was Burnaby and Richmond and Surrey and the North Shore. So involving all the different areas and trying to get them to feel as they were part of the community was also a challenge and something that we all tried to do, probably more successfully in some areas than others. And I think that problem, or that still exists, because the community is just gets bigger and bigger, and as the affordability of housing becomes so impossible in the center of the city, people are forced to move out into the outer areas, and trying to keep them involved and keep them, let them feel they're part of the Jewish community is an important thing and not always easy.
Let's talk about Federation, and obviously it has a certain place in your heart.
Yes.
So could you maybe share with us why you think it's important that people support Federation?
Well, because I believe, and having seen it, I was told obviously after we became federated the reason why, and I remember participating in meetings at the time and listening to, when people would come from the East to tell us why it was good that we do this and how it would help the community. And I've seen how because I've sat on the allocations committee in the past for a few years, and I participated as well as when I was president. And you can see how hopefully the funding is more evenly distributed, and so that one particular agency doesn't get more or isn't more heavily weighted than another. And I think those changes were good because, as I said, and I remember myself being guilty of it when I first started giving, I always, gave more to Israel because in those days I think Israel was more important in people's minds than I think she is today for many reasons. There's been a swing in many federations in that the funding for the local communities is much stronger than it was, and I think that's another change that has come about. And it's good in many ways because it does fund our agencies. We need to keep the schools and the community organizations running and well-oiled so that there are these resources for the community and the Jewish community. I guess one thing that impressed me about being a part of a federation as opposed to the way it was originally was when I first started going to the General Assemblies or to the Line of Judah conferences. And Lois and I discussed this as well, and she said the same thing, that when she first started going east and going to being, because she was in the Women's National Council for many years, you see the camaraderie in the other communities and how they all kind of blend with each other. And I remember the first time I went to receive an award in Washington, and I was the only person from Vancouver. And it was kind of a lonely feeling when you see all the other communities there. It was the Line of Judah conference, and all these women just so involved. And I came home trying to get more and more people, and I think over the years it has, not necessarily because of me, but I know there were other women that tried to get the women to go and become part of it, and also the community members to go to the General Assemblies, because you learn so much and you learn what your counterparts are doing in other parts of Canada and the United States. And there's a lot to learn and a lot of good ideas out there. And I remember always coming home, really energized from those events thinking, I'd like to bring a lot of it home to Vancouver.